So in this tutorial we're going to look at the pattern feature, and the specific type of pattern that we're going to look at is the fill pattern. So just like in the other pattern tutorials that we've done, I've created this flat plate feature, and I've put a boss in one corner of the plate feature. So if you can create something similar. What I've also done on this edge is I've put a large chamfer feature in as well. So if you'd like to replicate something like that, or if you've done part one of the pattern tutorials, looking at some of the other pattern types, then you should be able to reuse your plate that you created for that. So to access the pattern tool, I select the feature that I want to pattern, and then the tool becomes available. Click on the tool. By default the system takes me into the dimension pattern type, but we're going to look at the fill type. So if you want to change that to fill, and then you can see, as with all the other features, it tries to draw my attention to the inputs that it needs in order to create the feature. So it's highlighting this tab here, the references tab, and it's also highlighting this entry box up here. So if I hover over that, I get a little description of what it requires, and in this case it's area to be filled, click collector to activate, and then add or delete a sketch. Now I don't have a sketch currently, so I'm going to create a new sketch to use with this feature. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to click references. Again, it's asking for the sketch, and I'm going to click define. And in this case, because the feature's based on this top face, it's an extrude outwards from this top face, that boss feature, I'm going to sketch my pattern boundary on the top face as well. So I'll select the top face and then just click sketch. And it takes us into the sketch mode. So what we're going to do here is we're going to sketch a closed perimeter, and that perimeter is going to define the boundary of our pattern. One thing to note when you enter this sketch mode in the pattern feature is that this cross here represents the center point of your original feature. So in this case, this is the center point of our boss, our cylindrical boss. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly sketch out a boundary on the top of this plate that will contain our pattern members. And don't forget, this is quite a powerful tool, because obviously this boundary can be any shape that you want, and it will contain all the pattern members that we're going to create. So I'm just going to add in some constraints here. I might put a vertical constraint on this upright, and I could put in some of my own dimensions here, and you can dimension that up entirely. Yeah, but let's say we're happy with something like that. So we can OK that, and instantly we get a preview of a pattern that the system has created that fills that boundary. So let's look at some of the features that allow us to define where these pattern members are going to be. So let's move along from the left to the right and see how the different features affect how these pattern members are spaced on the plate. So we'll look at the first option here. This is space the members in an equal square pattern. So these are the base patterns that are going to drive the positions of your copies of your original part. So by default it's on the square spacing, so you can see that it's created pattern members in a horizontal line there, but it's also created pattern members down in a vertical direction as well, and that's because they're aligned both vertically and horizontally, and that's because we have the square pattern selected. So let's look at some of the other variants that we've got in here. We've got a diamond pattern, so you can see essentially what it's done is it's put a 45-degree movement on each point, so the spacing is still as it was before, but instead of the spacing being in a horizontal and vertical direction, it's switched to a 45-degree diagonal. And then we've got hexagonal pattern, so you can see what's happening there. I think with the hexagonal pattern it changes to a 60-degree spacing direction. And again, we've got lots of different patterns in there. We've got a concentric version, so you can see the original copy here, and then we've got rings of concentric pattern members. We'll look at a few of the others. We've got spiral, which, as you can see, it gives you an initial spiral shape there, just so you're aware of what's happening. We've got our original copy, and then the pattern members are spiraling out in this spiral shape at regular intervals again. And then the bottom one along the sketch curves. So essentially it's taking the original copy there and it's creating an initial copy out on the center line of our sketch, and then moving round the boundary of our sketch, creating regularly spaced copies around the boundary. So we've got all those different types of pattern types within the fill pattern, but if we switch it back to the square spacing again, and then we'll have a look at the second box. So this is the spacing of each pattern member, the distance. So we can play with this in real time by just dragging this square drag handle, and you can see the effect that that's having, and you can also see it changing in real time up in this entry box. If we want to just enter a set value in that box, we can, or we could double click on the value down here and we can change it down there as well. So that's pretty self-explanatory. That's the distance of the spacing between each pattern member. We've got other options here as well. We've got a boundary option here, which if we start entering some values in there, we can see what it's doing. So I've put a 10 in there. Let's put a 20 in there. You can see it's avoiding the boundary edges of my sketch by whatever value I enter in this box. So the larger the value, the bigger the boundary or margin, if you want to think of it as that. So it's creating a no-go area between the lines of my sketch and the pattern members. So that could be useful if you need to avoid the edges of a piece of geometry. So that's what that one's doing. There's an angular modifier here, so it's, let's say 15 degrees. You can see what's happening there. It's still a square pattern, but rather than being based on horizontal and verticals, it's skewed everything by 15 degrees. And again, you can play with that value in real time just to get a good idea of what's going on there and what that value is varying. And then the last one there is grayed out currently in this pattern type, but if we go back into the spiral, you can see that this is actually the pitch of the spiral itself. So you can have a very large pitch value where the spiral legs have a lot of space between each one, or you can have a very small one where the spiral legs are very close together. So yeah, the fill pattern is quite useful for regular spaced patterns that must grow or shrink when a sketch changes. So if you see, I can drag my sketch here, and if I put my specific dimensions on that sketch, I could enter new dimensions in there and the pattern would adjust itself accordingly. So it's useful to have patterns that are very reactive to the sketch geometry around them, rather than having to manually go in there and edit the number of pattern members. So that's the fill pattern.